At 38,000 feet over a dark, endless ocean, a commercial airplane suddenly started falling. Alarms screamed, oxygen masks dropped, and one calm woman quietly stood up from her seat because she knew this moment was coming. Passengers thought it was just turbulence until the captain collapsed, the cockpit called for help, and a voice no one expected spoke with absolute control. Minutes later, military fighter jets tore through the sky, locked onto the aircraft, and spoke a name over the radio that froze air traffic control in silence, a call sign known only to elite combat pilots. In that moment, everyone realized the truth. The person sitting among them was not just a passenger. She was the only reason 185 people were about to survive. Before you hear how an ordinary flight turned into a fight against death itself, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Just hours earlier, the same flight felt completely ordinary, a long overnight journey filled with quiet conversations, dim cabin lights, and the soft hum of engines cruising high above the ocean. The woman in seat 24 by the window didn't stand out at all, dressed simply, headphones on, flipping pages of a worn book like any other tired traveler trying to pass the time. The flight attendant paused beside her during service and asked what she would like to drink, and the woman answered politely, her voice calm, her eyes briefly drifting toward the wing before returning to the page. Out of simple curiosity, the attendant asked if she flew often, and the woman smiled and said she used to fly for a living. Nothing more, nothing dramatic, just a quiet sentence that raised no alarms. The passenger next to her leaned in, interested, asking what kind of flying she had done, and she shrugged lightly, saying she had seen enough skies in her life and was happy being just another passenger now. No one in that cabin could have guessed that this calm, unassuming woman was sitting there with the kind of experience that only reveals itself when everything starts to fall apart. What no one on that flight knew was that the quiet woman by the window had spent most of her adult life in places where mistakes meant death and hesitation meant never coming home. Years ago, she had been one of the few trusted to fly the most advanced combat jets in the world, sent into hostile skies where warning lights were normal and danger was constant. She had learned to stay calm while missiles locked on, to make decisions in seconds while metal screamed and systems failed, and to bring broken aircraft back when logic said they should never land. Her reputation was built not on bravado, but on consistency. She was the pilot commanders relied on when missions went wrong, the one who showed up when others were already preparing for the worst. That reputation earned her a call sign spoken carefully and with respect among fighter crews, a name given only after surviving impossible odds again and again. Eventually, after years of deployments and close calls, she walked away from that life, not because she had lost her edge, but because she wanted something quieter, something normal. She traded flight suits for civilian clothes, classified briefings for silence, and chose a life where no one expected miracles from her anymore. But experience like that never disappears. It waits, buried beneath routine and anonymity, ready for the moment when everything breaks and someone has to take control. The first sign that something was wrong was so small that most people would never have noticed it. A barely different vibration, a change in the engine's rhythm that slipped past untrained ears. The woman by the window felt it instantly, her body reacting before her mind could fully explain why, her eyes lifting from the book and locking onto the wing outside. A calm announcement followed from the cockpit, the kind meant to reassure passengers, explaining that the crew was checking a minor technical issue, nothing to worry about. But then came a smell, faint at first, sharp and unnatural, the unmistakable scent of something burning where it should not be. The cabin crew moved more quickly now, their smiles tighter, their voices more controlled, asking passengers to return to their seats and fasten their belts. The woman straightened in her chair, closing the book she had been pretending to read, because she knew this pattern too well. This wasn't routine. This was the quiet moment before chaos, the brief window when a situation does. The moment came without warning. The aircraft jerked violently to one side. The nose dropped, and the calm hum of flight was replaced by screaming alarms and terrified voices. Oxygen masks burst from the ceiling as the cabin plunged, passengers grabbing for them in panic while bags and loose items slammed against the floor. Inside the cockpit, everything was unraveling at once, systems failing, controls fighting back, and the captain collapsing in his seat as the aircraft began a rapid, uncontrolled descent. The first officer struggled alone, hands shaking as warning lights filled the panels, fighting a machine that no longer wanted to fly. In the cabin, flight attendants fought to stay upright, trying to calm passengers while knowing they were running out of time. That was when the woman in seat 24 unbuckled without hesitation, her movements sharp and deliberate, completely different from the quiet passenger she had been moments earlier. She stopped a flight attendant mid-step, looked her directly in the eyes, and spoke with a certainty that cut through the chaos, telling her she was a former military pilot and that the cockpit needed her now. As the aircraft continued to fall, the truth finally surfaced. This was no longer a routine emergency, and the only person who might be able to save them was walking forward through a cabin filled with fear. The cockpit door opened to a scene of pure chaos, warning tones blaring, lights flashing, and the aircraft fighting every input like a wounded animal. The captain was slumped and unresponsive, and the first officer was barely holding the plane together, her voice breaking as altitude disappeared second by second. The woman stepped in and placed a steady hand on her shoulder, introducing herself with calm authority, telling her to keep flying while she took the other seat. The moment her hands touched the controls, everything changed. Her movements were smooth, confident, and precise, as if her body remembered a language it had never forgotten. She quickly read the situation: severe damage, failing hydraulics, and a plane balanced on the edge of control, but not lost, not yet. As she stabilized the descent, she keyed the radio and spoke directly to air traffic control, declaring a full emergency and requesting immediate military coordination. Then she said the one thing that made the frequency go silent. She gave her call sign, a name known only inside fighter squadrons. Seconds later, a new voice came over the radio, sharp and unmistakably military, confirming her identity and launching fighter jets to assist. At that moment, hope returned to the cockpit because the fight had changed, and now they were no longer alone. The wait for help felt endless, every minute stretching as the damaged aircraft fought the air, the woman working the controls without rest, adjusting power, trim, and rudder just to keep them flying. Sweat ran down the first officer's face as she called out numbers, altitude, speed, fuel, her voice growing steadier with each successful correction. When the fighter jets finally appeared, they cut through the clouds like shadows, fast, silent, and precise, sliding into formation beside the wounded plane. A calm but serious voice came over the radio, asking permission to inspect the damage, and one jet peeled away, circling close enough to see torn metal and leaking fluid along the wing. The report was brutal, the damage was severe, the structure barely holding, and there would be no second attempt, one landing, one chance. The woman absorbed the information without emotion, already building the plan in her mind, adjusting speed, calculating distance, conserving fuel. She asked the fighters to stay with her all the way in, to guide her visually, to be her eyes when her instruments could not be trusted. As the diversion airport grew closer, exhaustion set in, arms aching, legs burning, focus narrowing to nothing but the runway ahead. Every person on board felt it now. The aircraft was still flying, but only because someone refused to let go. The runway finally came into view, a thin strip of concrete that now represented the only path between life and disaster. The woman took full manual control, disconnecting every system that could interfere, flying the aircraft by pure feel and instinct. The fighter jets flanked her on both sides, calling out alignment and distance, guiding her like silent guardians through the final descent. Inside the cockpit, every second mattered. Gear down, slight flaps only, speed higher than normal to keep the damaged wing alive. The aircraft shook as it crossed the runway threshold, metal groaning under stress, the ground rushing up faster than it should. At the last moment, she eased the nose up, bleeding speed gently, refusing to force the landing. The wheels hit hard but straight, tires screaming, the aircraft fighting to stay centered as she worked the controls with everything she had left. She held the nose off as long as possible, letting the air slow them down before committing fully to the ground. Finally, the plane began to slow, the end of the runway racing toward them, until at last the speed dropped and the aircraft stayed together. They had done it. One chance, no second try, and 185 lives were still alive because she never let the plane give up. The moment the aircraft came to a complete stop, silence filled the cockpit, broken only by heavy breathing and the distant sound of sirens racing toward them. Fire trucks and emergency crews surrounded the plane within seconds, their lights flashing against the damaged wings that had somehow held together. In the cabin, disbelief slowly replaced fear as flight attendants realized the worst was over and passengers began to understand they were alive. Over the radio, the fighter pilots spoke again, their voices no longer clinical but full of respect, acknowledging the skill it had taken to bring that aircraft down in one piece. The woman finally leaned back in her seat, hands shaking now that the danger had passed, exhaustion crashing into her all at once. The first officer turned toward her with tears in her eyes, realizing that the quiet stranger who had stepped in had just saved everyone on board. As the cabin doors opened and passengers prepared to evacuate, word began to spread quickly through the plane and across the airport. Something extraordinary had happened here. This wasn't just a lucky landing. It was a reminder of what preparation, experience, and refusal to quit can do when everything is on the line. As passengers stepped onto the runway, many turned back, searching for the woman who had quietly walked past fear and taken control when no one else could. Some cried, some prayed, some simply stood frozen, realizing how close they had come to never seeing their families again. One by one, people thanked her, not with perfect words, but with shaking voices and hands that refused to let go, because gratitude that deep is hard to explain. She listened, nodded, and smiled softly, never claiming to be a hero, never correcting anyone, as if this was simply what needed to be done. Later, when the noise faded and the lights dimmed, she stood alone for a moment and looked back at the aircraft, scarred, broken, but still standing. She had tried to leave that part of her life behind, the training, the discipline, the call sign, the weight of responsibility. But that night proved something powerful. You never truly stop being who you were trained to be. You only wait for the moment when it matters again. Because legends do not disappear, they sit quietly among us until the world needs them most.